Okay, Nancy, I will do so.
Okay, I'm sorry, Tom, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm turning off my slides and I'm putting up Greg's presentation.
Okay. Well, today we have Greg Fischer, who will be presenting for the second time this year his favorite avocation, the history and development of the Westwood area. We had some technical difficulties the first time around, and since the historical tour is composed mainly of photographs, etc., we have requested Greg to come back for a second try. Greg Fischer has served the Los Angeles community for a number of years. It began in 2001 when he worked as the Deputy of Planning and Transportation in the office of Jan Perry of Council District Number 9. During that time, he was heavily involved in the adaptive reuse ordinance to transfer downtown largely empty older office buildings into residential use over the first floor retail. He received a certificate of appreciation from the mayor for his extensive work in the field. As a mayoral appointee, he also served on the West Side Central Governance Council for Metro, the largest of the 5 councils in the Metro operate. In 2011, he resigned from the city service to form LA 1781 Inc., a firm that was focused on real estate activities and assistance for property developers with issues in the city of Los Angeles. His latest effort in that capacity was a 150 child care facility for Bright Horizons, a nationally recognized child care firm. He assisted with the fire, planning, and building and safety departments, as well as arranging help with the state child care licensing department. Greg has served on the boards of Immaculate Heart High School and the North University Park Design Review Board for USC City Planning. His obvious interest in history is evident as he has held a seat for 10 years on the Los Angeles Regional Planning History Group that meets in the Huntington Library. But in 2017, Greg dissolved his business and moved to Houston, Texas, where he works with the University of Texas Health Branch, assisting UT medical students in their quest to obtain a medical degree. From Houston, here is Greg, and Nancy will make you the host, which she's already done, so he can get started. You're up, Greg.
Here we are. I'm going to give you an overview of the early story of Westwood Village, basically starting at sort of what we might call an arbitrary beginning point, which is when the city of LA is founded. So if you look at the map on the right of the screen, you will see town, which is sort of in the middle. It says Pueblo de los Angeles, and it shows a little church, which is still there. The church parish dates to 1784. It sits on Main Street across the street from the plaza. If you move over to your left, you'll notice a number of ranchos. And Westwood sits in the Rancho San Jose de Buenos Aires, which is out toward the coast. It's a 4,400-acre ranch that runs basically from Pico Boulevard, realizing, of course, there are no streets in those days, to the Beverly Hills City line, to Sepulveda Boulevard, and then to a line that runs diagonally across the Santa Monica Mountains, roughly parallel to Shalom Road. Next slide. This is a man no one's ever heard of, named Arthur Lett. Next slide. Arthur Lett founded the Broadway department store at 4th and Broadway in 1895 with a loan. He took over an existing stock of merchandise that somebody else had failed with and built what we remember as the Broadway department store. I've lost my slide.
Oh, that is bizarre. Okay, I'll pull it up again. Don't know what
It
happened.
has. One of those things goes bump in the night. You'll never be able to explain it.
Okay, here we go. Next slide.
Yes,
Okay.
that's good. Broadway department store did very well. This is the 1914 version, which replaced the original. No backup. And in 1907, he was enticed to build a new store at 7th and Broadway, but he did not want to replace his Broadway department store at 4th and Broadway. He decided he would build a new store with a slightly different cast to it. And he took his general manager, John Gillespie Bullock, and installed him in the new store. And that's how we got Bullock's. So Arthur Letts was responsible for both of these store chains. Next slide.
Next after this.
That's perfect. So in 1919,
Oh, I'm sorry.
this is good. In 1919, Arthur Letts bought the remnants of the Rancho San Jose de Buenos Aires, which at this point was now 3,296 acres for $2 million in cash. It ran from the Los Angeles Country Club, which is on your right in the photograph accompanying the LA Times article, to Sepulveda Boulevard on the west, except for the Veterans Administration property. That had already been deeded over to the federal government. So that would include, the property did not include the VA cemetery or the federal building properties. And then it ran from Pico up to about what didn't exist yet, which was Sunset Boulevard. He also got some property above Sunset Boulevard, which is Holmby Hills, both north and south. And for $2 million, it was kind of a bargain. At the time, that was the largest cash real estate deal in the city of LA. Next slide. So here is some detail on this. We've already gone over it. We don't need to read it again. We go to the next slide. Now,
Okay.
Arthur Letts married a woman named Florence Philp, Philp, in Canada. He was living in Canada for a while in the 1880s. She built Owlwood, which house has been on the market recently in Holmby Hills. It's the largest single piece of property in Holmby Hills, running from now Sunset Boulevard down to LA Country Club. I believe it's 10 acres. They had 3 children, Florence, Gladys, and Arthur Jr. Florence married Malcolm McNaughton, who ran the Broadway on Arthur Letts' death in 1923. He is why we have Malcolm Avenue. They built the home demolished by Aaron Spelling, which was across the street from Holmby Park. Arthur Jr. built what is now known as the Playboy Mansion. Both of those properties were 6 acres, both in Holmby Hills. By the way, Holmby Hills is a corruption of Holdenby, which was where Arthur Letts was born in Northamptonshire, England. Down one more slide, please. The middle child, Gladys, married Harold Jans, whose father, Dr. Peter Jans, founded Jans Investment Company in the 1890s. Gladys and Harold lived on North Carolwood Drive, and it was Jans Investment Company that was chosen to develop the almost 3,300 acres of Letts property. Next slide. So here's a map by Jans Investment Corporation of their properties, their holdings. So you have Pico on the south, it's Sepulveda on your left. You have the Beverly Hills City line and the Los Angeles Country Club sort of on your right. The piece that's labeled Westwood Public Golf Course toward the bottom, and Fox Film Corporation, that's now all Century City. So this map dates to the late 20s, and it encompasses all of the Letts properties at that time. Next slide. So the original shopping area for Westwood was to be located at Wilshire and Beverly Glen. The street patterns east of Beverly Glen, north and south of Wilshire reflect that today. Most, but not all, of the alleys in this area were basically built for commercial purposes. And that includes north of Wilshire. Devon Avenue, which runs north of Wilshire, has a funny little street called Birchwood Drive on the back of it. That was originally to be one of the Westwood Village shopping center alleys. The one on the west side of Devon never got put in, and that was all deeded back to adjacent property owners. Arthur Lett sat on the board of the Los Angeles State Normal School, the predecessor of University of California Southern Branch, now UCLA. That was founded basically where the Central Library is today, downtown at Fifth, Flower, and Grand. It was his hope that the university would move from the cramped Los Angeles City College campus, today's now Los Angeles City campus, to the ranch, but he died prematurely in 1923 before this could be accomplished. I'll put in a piece here that's not listed on any of the pieces of information. His marriage to Florence Philp apparently did not go too well. He was a business guy, not too big on family. And in the spring of 1923, he announced his divorce from his wife, I believe on the grounds of desertion. And a week later, he died of pneumonia, which was kind of an unusual thing to do. In consequence of that, his wife inherited his whole estate because he hadn't had time to repurpose it. Next slide. This is the Westwood Observation Tower. It was a big practice at the time in the 1920s to build big signs. There was one in Cheviot Hills, there was one in Hollywood Land, there were a couple in Beverly Hills, so that you could see them from a distance. This one sat where the Wilshire Terrace sits, at Wilshire and Beverly Glen, the northeast corner. And the sign itself lit up. You could walk through the entrance at the bottom of the stairs to the viewing platform and see pretty well everything in Westwood, because that was a high point. And the lightning bolts and the sign itself lit up at night. So it was kind of an interesting thing to see from a distance. Next slide.
Sorry.
This kind of blurry photograph is the original Bullocks, 1931. Nancy's just advanced it one more to Bullocks number 2, which is more familiar. These sat at the corner of Wilshire and Weyburn, I'm sorry, Westwood and Weyburn. And they were the third Bullocks stores in the entire chain. It was fairly easy to get Jan's investment company to lean on the Lett's estate to put a Bullocks into Westwood, since the Lett's estate still owned all the land. You'll notice the original light fixtures, which were still around when I was growing up, which were all done in blue and blue fixtures with gold tiles at the bottom reflecting UCLA's colors. Next. And here's the Bullocks that was built in 1951. They closed the last block of Glendon Avenue from Weyburn to LeConte and built a much larger store to compete with the new J.W. Robinson store in Beverly Hills. If Beverly Hills hadn't gotten the Robinsons, I don't think Westwood would likely have gotten the larger Bullocks. Next slide.
Is that?
The original Desmonds, across the street from Bullocks, also at Westwood and Weyburn, this one at the southwest corner. You can see the Desmonds sign, the typical neon sign for Westwood Village, mounted on the roof and facing Wilshire Boulevard, so the motorists could see it. Next slide. Here is an updated, more contemporary vision of the original Desmond store that was done with sort of a streamlined look that was probably done after the war, and looks somewhat closer to what you can see today, which I believe is a pharmacy. Next slide. We lost the
Let's see.
screen.
Let me try that again. Okay. This is the last slide in the presentation that I have. Greg,
Yes,
that's the last slide in the presentation that you sent me.
I see you. You have the
Do you
whole
want, do you want me to put this back up? You were
Yes.
saying next slide, but that's the last slide.
Well, I don't have the slide, I have you.
Oh. Do you see it now? Is that what you're wanting?
No, I see you. It's a wonderful picture, but I can't do much with it as far as narrating.
Well, that's, you're seeing me, but you're not seeing your slide?
Correct.
That's very strange. Let me try this again. For some reason, the sharing screen function keeps shutting down. You can see it now, right?
No, now I can. If you'll just go back to that, and that's the perfect place to be. You can go back to slideshow at the top.
Right. This is what I'm saying is this is the last slide.
Yeah, this is fine.
Okay.
Perfect. Now we can go down one.
I'm sorry, down one.
Yes, ma'am.
Are you saying back to go back?
No, advance at one.
This is the last slide. That's what I'm saying. This is the last slide in the presentation that you
Oh.
see.
No, it's not.
Well, I'll show you. Can you see on the left?
Yes. So that's all you have. Let me
It
see.
has 16 slides and this is number 16.
No, mine's longer. For some reason, yours got annotated. Let me see if I can do something from here.
You're co-host, so I'll stop sharing and you can take over from your.
Okay. Let's see what we can do here. I need to.
Do you know how to do screen sharing?
Now, does that show up? What are you seeing?
I just see the gallery.
Yes. So it says early Westwood Village.
No, I'm sorry. I just see the members. I don't see your presentation. You see the green button down at the bottom where it says share screen?
Wait a minute. Let's go back to this. Mine was on share screen already. Yes, here we go. This should do it. Does that work?
Yes.
All right, now I will go down to, here we go. So can this be seen now?
Yes.
Perfect. This is where the 1100 Glendon Avenue high-rise is today. Very typical Jans. They took the commercial district and then rather than putting houses across the street from it, they put in multi-residential and backed into a full residential deal a little later, a couple blocks away. Here is the Westwood Homely Clock Tower, the second floor of which was the original women's dorm for UCLA. And that building complex is all one building. It is not a series of buildings, although it's built to look like that. It's actually one structure. It'd be very difficult to play with otherwise. Here is the original Jan's Investment Company headquarters under construction. And they had the original men's dorm on the second floor of this building, another block away. And by the way, the UCLA campus at that time was all centered around the quad. So getting up to UCLA was kind of a hike for these people. This is the Talk of the Town restaurant in the patio at La Ronda de las Estrellas, which is the building at the corner of Lindbrook Drive and Glendon Avenue. which now has a dome. The last I knew, it was the Gardens on Glendon, and then it took something else. Took it. Was it Skylight, another restaurant that took its place? Anyway, this is what it looked like when it was an open patio. This is Sonia Henney's Tropical Ice Garden on Lot 32 at UCLA, behind Gailey Avenue. I think you'd have a hard time putting that back in there today. No place to park. Here's Westwood Boulevard at Lynbrook Drive. You can see Ralph's on the far right with their sign. Sears Roebuck on the left. Corner Tower with neon sign. Neon signs were very popular in Westwood Village to attract people looking out from Wilshire Boulevard. Fox Westwood Village Theater is further back. On the left, sort of below the Sears sign, is the University Professional Building, where UCLA professors had their offices above the patio. So that gave the UCLA professors a place to office because there wasn't any place on the campus. This is almost oxymoronic. This sat at Wilshire and Westwood, and it showed you that, you know, beyond there was free parking, long since gone. This particular sign sat where Lindy Medical Plaza is now, 10,800, 10,900 Wilshire. And then there's a Chevron service station behind it. Here's a panoramic view of Westwood, Kinross, and Broxton, with the University Professional Building on your left, and Jan's Investment Company's building in the center, which had already, they had fiddled with their office space and rented the dome part of the building out to Bank of America. You can see the Fox Westwood Village Theater in the background. On your left and on your right, you can see the Holmby Clock Tower. You can also notice the width of the planted median down the middle of the boulevard and palm trees, which would be difficult to do today. So this is another look at Arthur Letts, by whom all of this was made possible. He's completely unknown. There is a plaque in Holmby Park dedicating the park to him by his son-in-law, Harold Jans, and Harold's brother, Dr. Edwin Jans. Sits in the pergola, kind of at Beverly Glen and Comstock. And that's now the end of it. I don't know what happened to the other 10 slides. So Nancy, that's the conclusion of the presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you. If you would turn off your screen share so that we can see everyone as they're asking questions, that would be great.
Done.
Wonderful. Thank you. Mike Newman, I see your hand up already.
Yeah, Greg, one of those last slides, the free parking one where the Lindy building went up.
Right.
When we were kids together, my vague recollection is both where the Lindy went up and then the Lindy was like the medical building, and the Kirkby on the northwest corner was the business building. But my memory was that those were basically two vacant lots forever. Is my memory right?
Technically not, because when they were putting up those two buildings, it was kind of awkward. Westwood Village Development Company was sold in 1955 by the two Jans brothers. And the person who bought it was George Gregson. And George had married Patricia Jans, which is why we have Patricia Avenue. And he retained the land under the Lindy Medical Plaza, but sold the Kirkby property to Arnold Kirkby, who died during the construction of that in '61. So half of the lots, each of them, were landscaping with the Westwood Village parking sign, and behind that, the northern half of the lots was a hedge, and there was parking behind that hedge. So those were basically parking lots with landscaping.
Interesting. Phil?
When did the Ship's Coffee House go in?
That was designed by the father of a gal who was in my class in grammar school. And my best guess would probably be 58.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I miss ships.
Tom, did you have a question?
Yeah, Greg, where did you get most of your research is the number one question, but following that, does UCLA have some historical development of Westwood as well?
Research, my grandparents moved to Warner Avenue in 1939. So Westwood Village was 10 years old at the time. And so my family can remember a lot of old Westwood. And I used to ask questions, and actually I could get answers. UCLA owes its existence in Westwood to Arthur Lett's estate and to Jan's Investment Company, who knew that Arthur Letts wanted the university to move to Westwood. Sort of a backstory to this, I was talking to Bill Jans one day, and he said that when the university regents came south on the train to Los Angeles in 1925, Jan's Investment Company sent 3 limousines to the Southern Pacific Railroad station on Alameda Street. This predates Union Station. With the instructions to do this, there were 3 sites that the regents were to look at. One was Palos Verdes, one was Van Nuys, one was Westwood. And the 3 limousines were being driven by Jan's Investment Company brokers. And they were told to do this in the following order. You take the regents down to Palos Verdes and make sure all the windows are down in the car, and they'll freeze to death. Then you drive them up Sepulveda Boulevard through the pass into Van Nuys. You should get there about noon. They'll die of the heat. Make sure the windows are up. When you're through with that, you come back to Westwood, probably about 3 in the afternoon, and the breeze will kick in. Remember, it's the ranch of St. Joseph of the Good Breezes. And it will be obvious to them which site they want. So the regents chose Westwood, but they also had a caveat. They would not purchase property. So the Jan's Investment Company and Arthur Lett's estate lowered the price per acre of the property, and the city of Los Angeles and the surrounding cities, Venice was still a city at the time. Sawtelle was part of LA, so that didn't count at the time. Beverly Hills, Culver City, they all chipped in, and they bought the property and presented it to the university regents, and that's how UCLA ended up on that property.
You know, in a couple of your photographs, you showed the men's dorm and the women's dorm, and on the second or whatever floors it was. There couldn't have been that many students, obviously, at that time.
There weren't. And realizing that the school was enlarging and moving further out, those didn't last too long in terms of their value. And I'm sure they were probably, after a couple of years, even during the Depression, at a premium. Capacity was very limited in those 2 buildings on the second floors.
I said, I have one more question. Have you thought about doing a book on this subject matter, or have you already done a book on this? Or
no, I've been told for years to write a book on LA, but unfortunately it would be longer than the Bible. There's just too much out there, and it goes back to 1781. It doesn't really, there'd have to be a series of volumes, and I don't think I'll live long enough to do all of those.
a book would be amazing. I know, I don't know if you know Steve Sand, but he's trying to put together a history of Westwood too, and it may be great if you guys could collaborate on putting out a book.
Well, Westwood deserves more attention than it's got for a number of reasons, some of which would explain why the village has had so many problems. But it's that would almost be its own book.
So I have a question. Greg, you now live in Houston, right? And is that a
Okay.
permanent move for you to Houston?
Yes.
And yet you maintain this enthusiasm and passion for the history of Westwood, which is intriguing to me.
Well, I actually used to lecture on history of LA from a planning and historical, et cetera, perspective. And it's a very interesting story. Most people don't realize that LA is the second oldest town in the state of California. And everybody screams and raises their hand and said, no, it's Santa Barbara, no, it's San Francisco. No, those were not towns. There were two towns founded in the original plan for the development of California, and LA was number two.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And there's reasons for all of that. It's long-winded. You don't want to hear about it today, but it explains why LA got to be as big as it did, because it began earlier.
I have a question.
There were some shenanigans too.
Brian, was that you?
Yeah, I have a question. But first, just an observation. I live in Westwood and walk the sidewalks. And for those of us that live in Westwood, it's kind of fun. If you look down, you can see the concrete stamp in the sidewalk for Jan's Investment Company. So if you pay attention, there's signs of the history everywhere. My question is about the Sonia Henney ice skating rink. Where exactly is that, and can you tell us a little bit more about when it was built and when it was taken down and the circumstances?
It was around in the 40s. It probably came in the late 30s. I don't know how much after the war, maybe a few years, not many. If you went down Kinross, which is the second block north of Wilshire, and went to the end of it, which is where lot 32 at UCLA is, that's where it was. So technically it wasn't in Westwood Village, it was on property that belonged to the Veterans Administration. And somehow, I've never understood how, because it's a very odd deal, UCLA ended up with that property. I imagine that they probably leased the tropical ice garden from the veterans or the federal government.
Interesting. More questions? One little factoid, which you probably know, I'm sure you know, Greg, that I learned recently that was sort of intriguing, is that UCLA Extension was actually established before UCLA, and that it was originally a UC Berkeley extension.
The University of California Regents did not want a southern branch, and they fought tooth and nail to keep it from actually appearing. But it became very awkward when it was published fact that most of the money that was being used to support Berkeley, over 50% of it came from south of the Tehashapis. So that's when they reluctantly established in the 19-teens an extension program, and they were not happy about it.
That's interesting. It's hard. It would be very difficult to imagine Westwood now without UCLA. It would be.
UCLA certainly did make a material contribution to the development of Westwood. Jan's used that in their advertising in the 1920s to death. And there were two things that moved property in the 1920s in terms of its popularity. And Jan's had both of them. One was an educational institution of some note, and the other was a movie studio. And that was William Fox moving from Western in Santa Monica out to Westwood.
Oh, interesting.
I also have, if anybody wants it, and Nancy can send those requests to me if they want it, I have a hideously long PowerPoint on Westwood and a shorter one on Holmby Hills. And it will give you all more information than you could possibly want. But if you have if you live in a particular part of Westwood, you might skip the rest of it and go to that. The Westwood one is almost 100 slides.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Yes, if you want to send that to me, I'll be happy to forward it to anybody who's interested.
Perfect.
Greg, one thing I've noticed in there, the property values at that time, do you have any idea what typical house would sell for, or piece of land around the Westwood area?
My grandparents moved into a Jan's Investment Company spec house, Spanish, 3-bedroom, bath and 3/4, and this one was unusual. It had a den on Warner Avenue near Rochester in 1939, and they leased it. During the war, the man who owned it decided he was going to sell it, and my grandfather said, "Well, what do you want for it?" And the man said, "I'm going to put it on the market tomorrow for $11,000. And my grandfather said, $11,000 for this tiny little house? And the man said, yes. He said, goes on the market tomorrow. And my grandfather said, I'll buy it. He had 4 kids still living at home, and he could not be forced into an apartment. Nobody was building anything.
$11,000.
Tom, I've had some clients on Weyburn, just 2 blocks north of Wilshire, that bought houses somewhere between like 29 or 30 and 34 for $6,000 each. And the reason I know that is we had a deal about 5 years ago with that was the tax basis of the property. That was now worth, what it was now worth over $3 million. But I had another question for Greg too, if I can.
Right.
So the Kirkby and the Lindy, in my mind, were the first 2 buildings to go up. And then what I still always call the Monty's building, where my office is now on Glendon, was the 3rd building to go up. And then up at LeConte and Westwood, just west of the Bullocks, where Security Bank was the 4th high rise of the high rises.
Right.
And what I always have trouble remembering is where we were at LeConte in that building that went up just west of Bullocks, the small Security Bank, which was a beautiful old building like the Bank of America, was on the corner of Weyburn and Westwood.
Right.
And so that got knocked down when that building went up, because that's where Hungry Tiger and the restaurants were later. But on the north corner, it's the primary part of the building, west, I guess now west of on LeConte and Westwood. Was that also a vacant lot forever?
No. North of Security First National Bank at Westwood and Weyburn was Brussels. And Brussels was a men's store. They had one on South Beverly Drive. They had one in Westwood Village. Then beyond that was a parking lot. And that was the corner.
So Greg, I've got a question about Los Angeles Country Club.
Okay.
And was did the Lett property, did it originally include Los Angeles Country Club? And if so, how was the decision made to sell that big chunk of developable property?
I'll restate your question because it's not wrong, but it's not quite the context we need. The LA Country Club property was originally part of the Rancho, but the property was sold to the Los Angeles Country Club Realty Association in 1904.
Right.
They paid $150 an acre or $48,000 for the 320 acres they bought. And it ran from the railroad line on Santa Monica Boulevard up to almost what is today Sunset Boulevard. The Wolfskill family, which owned the property, sold that early on. 1904 for them was a pretty early sale.
Are there mineral rights underneath the Los Angeles Country Club, similar to the ones under Hillcrest?
There should be. Unfortunately, the LA Country Club, I know for years, drilled for oil, drilled and drilled and drilled and found none. Now, on the other side of the LA Country Club is the city of Beverly Hills, a different rancho, the Rodeo de los Aguas. And that similarly had a number of people, Max Whittier, Burton Green, like Burton Way and Whittier Drive, drilling for oil, and they couldn't find any. So finally, in frustration, they turned their holdings into residential and decided they would create an upscale community in 1906 because the country club had bought their property in 1904 on the hill. And they knew that a lot of the people from the West Adams district would move west into the town of Beverly if they just stick the thing on the map. So they did. You actually had at Wilshire and Santa Monica, because Wilshire was not a major street at the time, Santa Monica was, there was a stop called the Country Club stop. And you could signal with semaphore flags up to the club and they would send a wagon down to collect you.
So on the LA Country Club property, there are tunnels, 2 tunnels below Wilshire Boulevard. Do you know anything about the entitlement to make those 2 tunnels?
Well, you have to realize that when Wilshire was extended further and further west, it wasn't much of a street. And for years, it didn't make any difference. I believe it was Arthur Letts that paid for those tunnels to be put in beneath the road.
Interesting. Brian, you had your hand up.
Yeah, that Westwood Cemetery is such an interesting cemetery. And if any of you have been through there, it's the final resting place for so much Hollywood royalty. Does that have an interesting history that led to it to be what it is?
You can go back into the 1880s when there was a building boom, and the Wolfskills, who owned the entire rancho, the 4,400 acres, lost their property in a really weird deal to the people who owned the adjoining rancho to the west, the San Vicente y Santa Monica. They had donated to the federal government 600 acres for the building of the Pacific branch of the National Soldiers Home. And they bought just the 150 acres east of Sepulveda, which is now the Veterans Administration Cemetery and the federal building, as part of the deal to give the 600 acres. Well, they went under on the deal, and the federal government said, okay, we're not, you can renege on the deal as much as you want, but we're not giving you back your 600 acres. And the Wolfskills unfortunately lost their 150 in the deal because the government wouldn't give it back to them. They at the same time had sold a lot of the land east of the veterans property for a town called Sunset. And Sunset was a paper town that never really was built. I think they built a hotel and a couple of other things. And the one thing that's still left is the Sunset Cemetery. And Wilshire had to be put through around the cemetery because the cemetery was the one thing that was still on the property from the old map.
Are we talking about the Westwood Cemetery or the National Cemetery?
No, the Westwood Cemetery. It was called the Sunset Cemetery. There are maps that still show that. Some of these questions are sort of like asking for the time and getting the history of Switzerland, but the answers are kind of complicated.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. Do we have more questions?
I put up as a background the Trumans Restaurant. The Westwood Village Rotary Club back in the 50s met at that restaurant, and just wondering if there are any interesting stories about Trumans Restaurant. That's at Wilshire and Westwood.
It had different names. Trumans is the name most people remember it as. In the corner of the parking lot, there was a man named Robert Leonard who had Leonard's department stores, appliance stores. And he also had real estate interests, and he kept his office in that space. Trumans was just the name of a succession of restaurants that were there. We used to eat there a fair amount of time, once in a while. Easy to get in and out, and they had bellhops, or not bellhops, car hops. At one time.
It was a drive-in out front.
Yeah.
So Bob Leonard was a member of the Westwood Village Rotary Club, and his son-in-law is Jim Collins.
Correct, and his son,
and
Robert Collins, I guess it was.
Jim Collins, and then he also had a son by the name of Leonard. But
yes. Yeah.
I bought a house in Westwood maybe 30 some years ago, and going through the title on it, the CC&R restrictions were extraordinary in its the exclusion of Jews and people of color. How did that happen?
All neighborhoods had the option of putting in their own restrictions, and the Supreme Court nullified all of those after the war. There was, and the real estate interests were very, very big in keeping those going as long as they could, but it was considered to be an affront to those who could not buy simply because they were born, quote unquote, wrong. So that disappeared. Those, if you try to enforce those CC&Rs today, people will laugh at you. But that, unfortunately, that's how it was at the time.
It's amazing. Do we have any more questions? Greg, I want to thank you for coming back. This is fascinating. It sounds like there are many, many stories that could be told about Westwood. I frankly had no idea. I think of Westwood as a fairly, I want to say confined area, not geographically large, but what a history. It's amazing.
Well, it covers roughly 3,000 acres if you throw Holmby Hills in. So it's actually a fairly large area. And you can't take Holmby Hills out of Westwood because Arthur Letts was Holmby, England.
Interesting.
All at the same time. I will send you the links to the other two presentations.
Oh, please. And anybody who wants them, let me know. I'd be happy to share them with you. And in appreciation for your time with us again today, we will be making a donation in your name to the Westwood branch of the Los Angeles Public Library. And we thank you for being a trooper and giving this another shot. It was really worth it.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Thank you,
Absolutely.
Greg.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Most welcome.
Everybody have a great week. See you same time, same place next Thursday, right before Memorial Day weekend. So be safe and well. Take care, everyone. Let's see.